It is the most important unsolved murder in the world today. If it had been solved, hundreds of thousands of people would not be dead. Russia and the United States would not be on the brink of nuclear disaster, and the fate of tens of millions of people now hangs in knowing who committed the killing. However, almost no one in the West has ever heard of it. Welcome to CrimeWaves. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to CrimeWaves. I'm Declan Hill, an associate professor of investigations at the University of New Haven. And each episode, myself and my student producers, and this week it's the great Maddie Backus and Angie Paulus, we interview one of the world's leading investigators on one of their great cases. And this week, it's a hugely important case. It's the story of the peace negotiations early in the war between Russia and Ukraine and how a number of those peace negotiators were killed. So on February 24th, 2022, as almost everyone knows, Russia invaded Ukraine. But by February 27, 2022, as almost no one knows, Russia and Ukraine began a series of peace negotiations. And at first, those talks went well. Progress was made on evacuating civilians from the conflict zones, and then the more serious subjects, joining NATO, demilitarization of the border, all those subjects began to be discussed to put in place a permanent peace. But then something strange happened. At the negotiations, delegates began to report symptoms of poisoning. And one person, the Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, was allegedly so badly sick that he asked his doctor if he was going to survive the night. And then the next day, the man whose murder we'll examine in this episode, Denis Kirev, was taken from his car on his way to the peace negotiations, beaten, and then shot in the head. His body was dumped on the streets at the very center of Kiev. And to this day, no one has been charged for the killing. Now, we know that Denis Kirev was murdered by a unit of the Ukrainian intelligence, the SBU, but we don't know who ordered it or who actually pulled the trigger. And to discuss this case is Professor Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa. Now, he's a native Ukraine. Professor Kachanovsky is one of the few utterly neutral, independent observers of the true situation in his home and native country. For example, in 2023, the entire Canadian Parliament, that's all the political parties, all the politicians, gave a standing ovation to a member of the Ukrainian Nazi battalion who was linked with Second World War atrocities linked to the Waffen-SS. And Professor Kachanovsky was the first and practically the only person in the Canadian media who raised the alarm on such a disturbing scene. So we at CrimeWaves turned to him to give us insight on the peace negotiations that could have ended the war within weeks and the murder of Denis Kirev. And throughout the interview, every few minutes, we're going to play just a little excerpt of the death metal song that was massively popular in Kyiv and throughout Ukraine during those dramatic early months of the war. It's a song, Valhalla Calling Me. And we began by talking about how bad much of the Western media coverage is on the war in Ukraine and Russia, and how most of the media missed the deliberate burning alive of 85 peaceful protesters in Odessa by the very forces that we support. 85 people could have been burnt to death in Odessa for protesting the Maidan. And again, I have no opinion on the Maidan. I'm not an expert like you. But that 85 people could have been burnt to death, and one has no idea of that in our media. I find it extraordinary.
Yes, and I just published peer-reviewed article on this topic looking to far-right massacre of these people, Russian separatists in Odessa, but also civilians who were in a trade union building, which they were killed basically openly on live television. And since the start of this massacre, media again did not report this or misrepresented this. And I gave just interview about this massacre to Guardian on the day that it happened. And the Guardian never reported my interview. Even I researched this issue, and I'm expert, but again, they reported very different kind of take. And this is just very typical of the media.
There are peace negotiations, which I don't think most people knew about. Tell us about these peace negotiations. When did they start?
I think this is a very crucial issue of the war between Russia and Ukraine, because this issue is totally misrepresented by the media or totally just blacked out by the media, not reported by the media. So these negotiations, according to Alexei Arestovich, who was at the time advisor to Zelensky, President of Ukraine Zelensky, and a member of negotiation team between Russia and Ukraine after the start of Russian invasion on February 24th, 2022. So he said that Russia offered peace talks on the day of the invasion. So basically, immediately after they invaded Ukraine, they offered peace negotiations with Ukraine. I think, and this is also very important to understand the importance of these peace talks, because focus of the media was only on military aspect, but peace negotiations were completely ignored. And this offer was taken by Ukrainian side. So Ukrainian officials were willing to negotiate, and Zelensky openly stated this, and the talks started a few days afterwards in Belarus.
So within 72 hours of the invasion that everybody witnessed on the BBC and the CNN and all these things, there was actual peace negotiations to stop the war.
Yes. And these negotiations were taking place again were offered by Russia. And Ukrainian side was willing to negotiate, and they sent delegation of top officials, top representatives of Ukrainian government to Belarus, including Minister of Defense, including head of Zelensky faction in the parliament, and other members, including actually the member who was killed, Denis Kireev, but he was not officially a member of this delegation. So I think this is another aspect. But very top officials were sent from Ukrainian side to these negotiations.
So this is serious negotiation team. This isn't some joke by the Russians to fool them. This is serious, credible peace negotiations within days of the war.
Yes, I think this is based not only on presence of such negotiators from Ukrainian side, but also by recollections which they gave to the media after these talks. And specifically, Arestovich said that he, when he was taking part in these negotiations, Putin was making phone calls to head of a Russian negotiation team in the talks which later take place in Istanbul and online also, and giving him instructions and basically how to proceed in such talks. So this was very important sign that the talks were genuine and that this was not just a sham, which was again presented by the media, because they said that head of Russian delegation Medinsky was not empowered to do this, but actually all the evidence suggests that he had such a mandate and he had a direct line of contact with Putin to make a deal on Russian behalf. But when the talks started, initially, Russia basically issued demands to Ukraine, which were very similar to demands from Putin, who announced his invasion, justifying this, again, illegal invasion under international law. But he justifies this invasion by demanding that Ukraine would be a neutral country, that there would be demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine. And so this were his main demands, and also recognition of separatist republics in Donbass. And just today, there was publication in Radio Svoboda, which is U.S. Congress-funded radio now based in Prague, in Czech Republic. And this publication stated that they obtained a copy of a Russian peace plan proposal, which was given to Ukrainian delegation on March 7. And in this peace plan, again, which peace deal proposal by Russia, it included all these basic points. It included neutral status of Ukraine.
So no entrance into NATO,
Yes, no NATO
demilitarized
member.
Ukraine so they couldn't invade Russia, and recognition of the eastern states.
Yes, recognition of separatist republics in the borders of Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which was recognized by Russia unilaterally as independent states shortly before Russian invasion. And there was also demand of the denazification of Ukraine and so on, which is in this peace treaty, and Ukraine would have no military bases and so on. And there was a provision for Russian troops to remain in Ukraine. There was a provision that the fighting would stop on the line of control at the time of peace deal signing. And in this situation, Russian troops would remain in territory which they occupied until Ukraine would fulfill all these demands by Russia.
There were lots to talk about, but at least there was some debate. And was the fighting at the time of the peace negotiation? Was it at some point were the Russians holding back? Was the conflict less, or was the conflict carrying on and the peace negotiations were going on at the same time?
This was going at the same time. Basically, there was, I think, as far as I remember, just one offer from Putin for suspension of Russian invasion or stopping Russian assault on Ukraine for about 1 day or something for a very short time, but this was not very important. So fighting was taking place at the time of peace talks. And in this case, again, Russian demands were basically meant that Russia did not want to occupy entire Ukraine, but was basically demanding neutral status of Ukraine, becoming de facto client state of Russia, and also which would lead to a regime change in Ukraine, basically changing policy and orientation of Ukraine from a pro-Western state to a client state of the United States, to a neutral country, or pro-Russian state similar to Belarus. So this was kind of outcome would be, so Ukraine could have been a similar situation to Georgia right now, which is neutral country, again, pro-Russian state like Belarus.
Roman Abramovich, what is his role? The billionaire owner of the Chelsea Football Club at that time, is he involved in the peace negotiations?
Yes, this is also very important to understand that in addition to official delegations taking part in peace talks in Belarus and later in Istanbul, there were other people involved in these peace talks. They did this informally. And one such person was Roman Abramovich, who was oligarch who lived in the United Kingdom, but was a Russian oligarch. And he was also basically involved in these negotiations because he has relations and links and contacts in Ukraine as well as in Russia. So he was able also to have such a kind of intermediary in these peace talks, even though he was regarded as person who had, again, also contact with Putin and was Putin oligarch. So in this case, he also was involved in these peace talks. In addition to this, then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was involved in peace talks as well. And he traveled to Moscow, and he gave interview also recently, which I also posted and became viral on Twitter, in which he said basically that in this interview, he said that he discussed with Putin also peace deal, which would lead to end of the war, and then the demands of Putin included all this denazification, demilitarization, basically the neutral status of Ukraine.
You have serious, credible people in these peace negotiations. There's talk back and forth. But in early March, something starts to happen. They're first poisoned. What happens with the poisoning of the peace negotiators?
And so in this case, peace talks were taking place, and there were also reports about poisoning taking place, including, I think, there were reports that Abramovich was poisoned, and other members of Ukrainian delegation and Ukrainian members of delegation might have been poisoned. But according to information which I saw afterwards, there were reports there was no such confirmation of this poisoning. And this is quite surprising because it's still very difficult to know what was actually happening.
Yeah, it was a very strange one because as we were researching this interview, we saw credible reports coming out of Bellingcat, coming out of the Wall Street Journal, that Roman Abramovich was so worried about the poison that he thought he had got from eating chocolate at the negotiating that at one time he asked the doctor, am I going to make it? And there's three other people in the negotiation team who were allegedly poisoned. And the foreign minister of Ukraine, when the peace negotiations go to Istanbul, warns them saying, don't eat anything, don't drink anything, and don't touch the surfaces. And then at the end of March, all that story seemed to have been wiped clean. There's no mention anymore of this poisoning. There's nothing about that. And in Western media, it just disappears. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Again, I think in Ukrainian politics, poisoning is a very important political factor because the most famous case of this poisoning was in 2004 when then presidential candidate, pro-Western presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned with dioxin, and his face changed totally. It became disfigured, and this poisoning was a very important factor in his victory because a lot of people suspected, and Yushchenko immediately stated that this was poisoning by then his rival Viktor Yanukovych in order to prevent him from winning elections in 2004. And these elections were falsified in the first round, and afterwards there was mass protest which taken place, and Yushchenko won the elections as a result of a new round of elections which took place. And a lot of his support came from people actually because they believe this is actually what taking place.
But look, there's been long history of the Russian secret services killing people by poison. Back in the 1981 in Bulgaria, there was a famous Bulgarian dissident who was killed with a poisoned umbrella in a London bridge. There's the former KGB agent in 2006 eating sushi at the restaurant in London who was irradiated with radium. And of course, there's Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned. He had to fly out of Russia and go to Germany for treatment. So poisoning is not surprising with a Ukrainian or Russian context.
But yes, but I think also very important kind of, even going back to KGB, there were like specific Soviet secret police under Stalin. They had a specific laboratory which would devise such poisons, and they use such poison to eliminate their political opponents or dissidents and so on under Stalin. So this was going back to very long history of such poison.
Hey, it's Declan here. That music you're hearing throughout this episode is some of the death metal music that was hugely popular in Ukraine during those early months of the war. And I also want to take just a little moment here to speak about CrimeWaves and the ethos of our program. Because in each of the episodes, one of the students takes a specific cold case or an investigative theme, and they research it completely, intensely, and they track down the best person to speak to that case. I pride myself on teaching the students that it doesn't matter what their political views are. They can be pro, anti-Trump, Democrat, liberal, whatever. What matters are the facts of each investigation. And that's a really important lesson for an investigator to have, particularly now in these troubled times. I'm going to teach my students that complete rigorous neutrality. You've seen it in our investigations into the probable origins of COVID from a communist Chinese research laboratory. That's a series that got us censored and shadow banned on Twitter, X, and now LinkedIn. And you may have also seen it on our work on the Epstein death in the New York prison, where we tracked down not just the medical examiner who looked at his body, but also Epstein's lawyer and brother, all of whom claimed his death was a homicide. But in the CrimeWaves way, we also got high-level international drug traffickers, one of whom was in the prison at the same time as Epstein, and they think it was suicide. That's the CrimeWaves way. Rigorous, fair investigation. So if you like the program, if you like our impartial, unbiased approach, please subscribe or like the program on whatever podcast platform you watch or listen to us on. It's massively important. It also, frankly, makes the students' day. So please do so. Just please like and subscribe to us. So now, back to the interview. At these peace negotiations, you have this alleged incident where 4 of the negotiators are poisoned. And then the next day, or soon after, on March 3rd, Denis Kirov, who's also in the negotiation room, is killed on the streets of Kyiv. Tell us about that, please.
So in this case, there was assassination of Denis Kireev, which was initially reported in Ukrainian media that he was assassinated or killed during his attempted arrest by Security Service of Ukraine in Kyiv, near to headquarters of Security Service of Ukraine, because he was suspected as being a Russian agent. And so this was official
story. Yeah.
Story. But immediately afterwards, there was a publication by military intelligence of Ukraine stating that he actually was their own agent. So he was agent of military intelligence of Ukraine, and that he participated in these peace talks as their representative, and that he was, again, basically not an agent of Russia. And this was stated by head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, and he stated this also in the media, in media interviews, and this story goes back even quite recently, because there were, again, official investigation did not say what happened. There were no results of official investigation revealed to this day. Even Budanov said that Kireev was killed by officers from State Security Service of Ukraine, and this was not just accidental killing. This was related to much bigger issues, which he did not mention, but I think it's quite clear what happened. Might be very likely to see what happened, that this was not accidental killing, that this
it was definitely not an accidental killing, and that was what intrigued me, because the first official story is that the SBU, that's Ukrainian intelligence, picks him up. The bodyguards, Kirov's bodyguards, later say, "Oh, we were told we're not supposed to protect him. You look like the most useless bodyguards in the history of bodyguards. You've let your guy be picked up." They pick him up in central Kyiv, and the headquarters of SBU are 200 meters away. And so they pick him up, they put him in a van, and less than an hour and a half later, this is just after 9 o'clock local time, and then in 90 minutes, he's dead on the streets. And he's not just dead. We have the photos. I think we'll put some of them up on the screen. You can see he's been beaten. So it's not as if he's run away and they had to shoot him in the back as he runs away. It's clear that they have both beaten him up and then executed him. Why? Why would they do that to a peace negotiator?
He was heading to a train station to go to peace talks, that he will receive a kind of a phone call from Ukrainian Security Service, State Security Service of Ukraine, Counterintelligence Division or Department of this service, and that he went with his bodyguards to this meeting to headquarters of State Security Service of Ukraine, and that he was intercepted basically just within a few hundred meters from headquarters, and then his bodyguards basically who actually were also from military intelligence of Ukraine, were put on the ground, and that officers from State Security Service of Ukraine detained Kireev and put him in their van. And afterwards, that he was killed very short time afterwards with sign of torture, and that there were reports in Ukrainian media that he had a gunshot in the back of his head, and
yes.
That he was handcuffed, and his body was found near the kind of a district court of Ukraine, very close to headquarters of State Security Service of Ukraine, in a very busy downtown location. So this is
that's what I also find extraordinary about this, is that it's not like this is in the war front, or this is at the front line, or it's in some obscure back alley. This is right in the power center of Kyiv, to one of their most official people who's just about to go on a peace negotiation. And then a few hours later, Evgeny Shevchenko, who's also in the peace negotiation, runs to the border. He runs to the Polish border, and the SBU picks him up and arrests him and throws him in jail. So in less than 10 days after the peace negotiations started, you've got this alleged poisoning of the peace negotiators, where allegedly 3 or 4 of them, including Roman Abramovich, fear for their lives. You've got one of them who's tortured and shot in the head in the center of Kyiv, and then the other one who is fleeing and trying to escape the country and only gets arrested on the Polish-Ukrainian border. What is happening at that moment? Why is this happening?
I think this is a very important issue. So there are different media reports which I rely on in my analysis of this issue, and Ukrainian media reports, and also there was publication in Wall Street Journal about assassination of Denis Kireev. So they reported a lot of similar evidence. So according to this information, which was stated by Budanov himself, SBU, or State Security Service of Ukraine, knew in advance that Kireev was working for military intelligence of Ukraine. But Kireev was also a banker, financial, involved in finance and so on. He also was involved in politics of Ukraine before this, which is also quite corrupt. So he also was very rich. And also shortly before Russian invasion, he was publicly accused on Ukrainian television by a television channel of Lukashenko being a
Russian yes.
agent. So there were already such accusations, public accusations that he was a Russian agent. So there was, I think, one of a possible explanation of this, which is mentioned by the media and suggested by Kirill Budanov, who is head of Ukrainian military intelligence, that this assassination was a result of was deliberate assassination of Denis Kireev by Security Service of Ukraine, specifically by Counterintelligence Division, as a part of politics, basically, or some kind of rivalry, because the head of this division was a person who actually was working for, or was close associate or working and appointed to this position by a very powerful head of office of President of Ukraine, which is still in office. And even he had criminal conviction, so he was convicted for a crime. So he became very senior person in state security of Ukraine, and there are media reports that he was involved in torture, that he, even within state security of Ukraine, he had the reputation of basically being a kind of butcher and was responsible. And there are media reports that he was involved in assassinations before he became, as a part of criminal organization, before he moved to become a lawyer.
And maybe this butcher, to use the Ukrainian media word, killed Kirov, a peace negotiator, because they said he was a spy for the Russians. But yes, within 24 hours, Zelensky has said, no, he wasn't. He was a hero of the Republic. And they gave him a medal posthumously. They came to his funeral and said, oops, we made a mistake. Here's a medal. Sorry, you're dead, but here's a medal.
There were many other such assassinations taking place shortly after Russian invasion or disappearance of political opponents or people who were accused of being Russian agents. So they were killed or disappeared without any investigation and any information. So they are just gone. And there are reports that this might have been also work of State Security Service of Ukraine, and specifically this division, Counterintelligence Division, which was, I think, very important, that this division still, just the recent reports that this person who is in charge of this division wanted to replace Kirill Budanov as the head of Ukrainian military intelligence because of, again, but this story is still ongoing. But there were many similar assassinations taking place before, and also before this, the same division of Ukrainian State Security Service was responsible for assassinating leaders of separatist republics in Donbass as part of their kind of undercover work before Zelensky became president. And this continues afterwards. There were similar assassinations in Russia. Dugina, who was a daughter of a Russian far-right.
Yes. Yeah, they blew her up. Yes, I remember that. But this is an ongoing issue. Maddie Bacchus, who's the student who's been doing the research on this, found me the United Nations Human Rights Commission report in 2016 talking about the number of political opponents who'd been killed without any investigation, or at least no investigation where the murderers had been found. In fact, there was an allegation in the report that she found was that the prisons in the Ukraine were so full, frequently people were just being killed because they couldn't put them in prison. Could you speak about those conditions, please?
Yes, there were reports at the time by human rights organizations and by United Nations about secret prisons by SBU, by State Security Service of Ukraine, and detaining the people and torturing them and so on, and also people who were killed during such interrogations and so on. So this was quite common kind of event taking place, and obviously after Russian invasion this was even much more significant. But in contrast to this, after Russian invasion there were no human rights reports, basically, and almost no media coverage in the West about this issue. So this is one of the changes. But I think so. This is, I think, often also aspect which is not very good represented in terms of media coverage. Another issue is that this division of kind of and state security service of Ukraine became under strong patronage of the United States after.
I was just going to ask that because I saw the New York Times article talking about the heavy influence of the CIA on the Ukrainian Secret Service. And as somebody who grew up in the 1980s and 90s when the CIA was heavily involved with human rights atrocities in Latin America, be it Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, where they killed over 250,000 people, I was wondering how much influence the CIA had on Ukrainian intelligence in these deaths at that time.
I don't have any specific information about specific involvement of U.S. In this case, U.S. intelligence agencies in this case, but according to reports by New York Times and Washington Post, these agencies has very strong influence. In addition, not only U.S. agencies, intelligence agencies, but also British ones. Over
like MI6 and those British intelligence.
Yeah, and this take place after the Western-backed violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government of Yanukovych in 2014 as a result of Maidan massacre, which was, according to my research, which is just recently published as a book by a major Western academic press, was a false flag operation which was conducted and perpetrated by elements of Maidan opposition and by far right in Ukraine, specifically to blame falsely government of Yanukovych in order to set his power in Ukraine. And this is, I think, another illustration of this. So you have also geopolitical dimension. So there was, again, basically, I call this patronage over by Western intelligence agencies over Ukrainian intelligence agencies and security agencies after 2014, and this continues after Russian invasion, and even became even more significant. But it's not clear to what extent, like, U.S. had involvement or any kind of even knowledge. Right. Specific actions like this, because again, I don't think this was just a direct control over by U.S. intelligence. So there was a lot of autonomy by Ukrainian intelligence officials and security officials in their own operations. So it's very difficult to know.
We're in the land of allegations because still 2.5 years after Denis Kirov, 2.5 years after the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, we still don't have any answers as to who killed Denis Kirov or who poisoned him. However, we do know what happened to the peace negotiations. By the end of March 2022, they had a deal. The Russians and the Ukrainians had a deal to stop the war. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yes, this is, I think, another major area of my research, which will be also included in this book, which is supposed to be published shortly by a major Western academic press. So I examined this in detail. So I can say that based on all the evidence, which is just beyond any kind of doubt, it's possible to say that such a peace deal was very close to being finalized in April of 2022, just a few weeks or several weeks after the Russian invasion. And in this peace deal, which text of which was published, there were different drafts of this peace deal, but the latest one, which was negotiated on April 15th, 2022, was published recently by New York Times. And in this peace deal draft, basically, Ukraine agreed to be a neutral country, not a member of NATO. And also there was agreement that Ukraine would not develop nuclear weapons. There would be no foreign military bases on Ukrainian territory.
What happened to those? What happened to that peace deal? Who stopped it?
Yes, this peace deal was basically very close to being finalized, and there were even talks about a summit between Putin and Zelensky to finalize this peace deal, and specifically to resolve issues which were remaining issues about status of Donbass, which was to be decided, and basically on some issues about size of Ukrainian military. This is issues which were supposed to be decided by Zelensky and Putin personally in their kind of meeting, but it never took place. And according to numerous sources, I think about a dozen participants of these peace talks from different sides, it's very clear that these peace talks were blocked basically de facto blocked by Western countries, including specifically United Kingdom and the United States. And this was stated by former Israeli Prime Minister, who was Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Natalie Bennett, who said...
Sorry to cut you off about the Israeli Prime Minister, but I'm struggling to grasp this because Now, November 2024, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and about the same number of Russians have been killed in this war. And your book is showing that there was a peace negotiation that was almost ready to be solved, so those guys didn't have to die.
Yes, I think this is this is the implication of this blocking of this peace deal, because in the interest of Ukraine it was better to accept such a peace deal, because as a part of this peace deal even Russian forces would have to be withdrawn from all occupied territory with the exception of Donbass, status of which would have been decided. So,
and I just think of all those widows, all those orphaned children who sat beside a grave as their loved ones are going into the earth and death. I think of a Ukrainian pacifist who used to be very pro-Maidan, who went out to Donbass in 2015, and he said there are no colors when you see the inside of a young man's entrails bubbling up after he's been killed. So we could have avoided that, except the Western powers, America and Britain, stopped this peace negotiation.
Yes, and I think this is a major implication of this, because such a refusal to basically to sign this peace deal, which was very close to be signed and finalized, I think meant that a lot of devastation to Ukraine in terms of very large human casualties, and especially military casualties, which is now, according to my estimate, is more than 140,000 killed and several hundred thousand wounded, which is and a lot of civilian casualties as well, which is again estimated about 15,000 civilians killed in Ukraine, including separatist controlled part of Russian occupied part of Ukraine. And there is devastation of economy, and there is no real possibility of getting any better peace deal now compared to what was offered and possible to be signed in 2022. And this war, which basically continued since this refusal to sign this peace deal, basically became a proxy war between the West.
Yeah, what's that phrase? We're going to fight to the last Ukrainian from the Americans. Yeah.
Yes, so basically this is what was going on. Ukraine is used as a tool, and Ukrainians are used as a tool by Western governments, in particular U.S. government and also British government, which act in connection as ally government of U.S., specifically to weaken Russia, because even then it was very clear that there was no possibility of Russia being defeated by Ukraine because of a very big Russian military advantage.
Like Canada fighting America.
Yes.
We're a great country, but we're not going to beat the Americans.
Yes, so instead of supporting such a peace deal, the U.S. basically administration and British government, also under Boris Johnson, they decided to use Ukraine as a kind of proxy to fight Russia without sacrificing lives of their own citizens, their own kind of military, but kind of with very significant cost to Ukraine in terms of human lives and other kind of costs, because Ukraine would not be able now to get even any better deal.
Is there a chance that it was Western intelligence agencies behind the death of Denis Kirov and the poisoning? Is there a chance that this was a deliberate sabotage of the peace negotiations?
I think one of possible theories which is mentioned for his matter is, and maybe also for poisoning of negotiators during such peace talks, was that this was aimed at blocking or derailing such peace talks, because it would be obvious explanation. So in this case, again, U.S. involvement might be a possibility, but I don't see any evidence backing this. So there is no such evidence.
A couple final questions. Are you a Russian agent? Are you a man who's on the side of the Russians?
I think even such a question just shows total
ignorance.
Yeah, total degradation or dumbing down of discourse now, because anything which goes against all this mainstream narrative promoted by politicians and media is immediately you have accusations of this is somebody works for Russia and so on. Obviously, I have no connection with Russia whatsoever. I'm Ukrainian from Western Ukraine. I get my PhD in the United States. I work in major universities like Harvard, University of Toronto, Library of Congress, now at the University of Ottawa. So I have no connection to Russia. At all. I have never met with Russian officials. Again, I never visited Russia, with exception of just in 1992 going to a conference in Estonia on my way, so just for a few days. So this is just quite unbelievable, because immediately anything which goes against this narrative, they try to raise such a totally fabricated issues and and even go against scholars like me, which is a Ukrainian scholar who researched this conflict for a very long time. I wrote my dissertation on the topic of conflict, so I specialize in this topic. I'm one of the most cited scholars, political scientists on this topic, but again, because they cannot have any evidence of it, so they often make such ridiculous and false claims.
So I asked that question just to make sure the listeners know that I've done my research and I'm not bringing somebody who's not intelligent to CrimeWaves podcast. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to reading the book when it comes out. And my students have been listening engrossed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Declan here. Denis Kirov's case is still open. It's still being investigated by the Ukrainian authorities. However, seeing as he was killed and his body was dumped more than 3 years ago, and this all happened just in front of the military intelligence headquarters in downtown Kiev, and no one has been arrested, let alone put on trial, we are a long way from finding justice in this particular case. As for Mr. Kirov's widow, she left the country. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of Crime Waves on the killing of Denis Kirov, one of the peace negotiators between Russia and Ukraine. And if you enjoyed this episode of Crime Waves, please like or subscribe to the show. It's massively important for us. All the students really, really appreciate it, as do I. And it also helps us with the algorithm, which drives the popularity of the podcast. Conversely, if we got something wrong, it's always my fault. It's never the students. So please drop us a line. We take every comment, every opinion very, very seriously. We read them and we will respond to you. Thanks so much.